Hello, welcome to your very first chapter in this course. So for today, we are going to look at the essentials or fundamentals in information security. So basically for today, we are going to look at the overview of what needs to be covered in information security, and also perhaps you will see some of the topics that you have previously learned in other subjects. So for today, the chapter is divided into two parts. So on the first part here, you will see that we are going to look at the concepts of information security. And most of the concepts you have heard about before in other subjects such as information security or computer security. And also we are going to look at components of an information system, followed by what are needed in information security planning. And as for the part 2, we are going to look at security in the system's life cycle. Means that in terms of planning for security implementation, we are going to look at the implementation in terms of what are we going to actually do, the activities with regard to the system's life cycle. And then we are going to look at security professionals and organization, and also what is there, why is there always a need for security planning and also implementation. So I hope you are ready. So let's go. Here are some tips that you can use while viewing the video. First of all, always remember to take a 5-minute breaks after about 15 to 20 minutes of viewing the video. Secondly, view the video together with the slides that you can download from our Moodle. Third, review all those parts or perhaps the facts before you actually continue to another part of the video. And most importantly, ask questions if you are unclear of any part of my lecture. So, before we begin, here are the checklists for today's presentation. So, we are going to look at, first of all, understanding the concepts of information assurance management and also the computer security model. Secondly, you will need to actually understand or list the components of information assurance, followed by the last part for the part 1 is for you to be able to relate IA components with the security implementation process. Now on to part 1, which is the concept. Now first of all, let's differentiate between information security, ICT security, and cyber security. So first of all, information security, just get this basic idea. It is about the protection of information. So by that, where do you actually get information? Okay, so nowadays we get information perhaps from when we are entering our information. You know, when we are entering the data, like when you are registering, for example, and also when you are actually printing out your information, or you have customers actually keying the information when they are registering for your services. So those are information. So basically, the protection of information is considered an asset. So in information security, that information that you obtain or that you use is a very important asset. So this protection of assets include any aspect of the information itself. It means that where did you actually get that information and where are you going to use that information. So basically, information security is a very well-informed sense of assurance that whatever risk with regard to the information and also whatever controls you have to protect that information are in balance. Means that there are certain risks to every asset that you have. Perhaps there is a risk of theft, there is a risk for information to being misused, and also the controls that you have to actually protect that information. For example, you have access control, you have authentication, you have passwords. Those are controls. So in information security, the risk means that you understand the risk that comes with protection or the use of information, and also you understand there is a proper control need to be in place to protect the information. So that is information security. So next is cybersecurity. You know, I think most of you are cybersecurity students. So what is actually cybersecurity? So remember previously we have information security. Now cybersecurity actually is the protection of those functions in cyberspace. Means that, okay, once your information or your transaction moves into cyberspace, you know, the internet or anything that people can connect to, okay, now it is in the realm of cyberspace. So this right now, after that, the assets needs to be protected comes in the bigger range. So means that now your information or the data travels to household appliances. Now we are actually dealing with society, and also we have critical national infrastructure. Remember, we have uh, utilities, you have perhaps any energy compliance devices. For example, we have smart devices, we have IoT. So now it is covered by cybersecurity. And also you need to remember that cybersecurity also covers the realm of the people who are using it. Where does that information travel to? Who is using that information? And then also the processes in terms of where did you get that information? How did that information gets processed? And also the technology behind the use of information and when you actually securing information. Now, remember, cybersecurity is very large and it is not actually physical security. So usually people confuse between physical security and cybersecurity. This is particularly true in your final year project, for example. Some students find it hard to actually differentiate between physical security and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is anything that happens in cyberspace. This with regard with people and the policy, for example, the processes that involve, and the technology that's being used. So from the very get-go, you need to differentiate between cybersecurity and physical security. Physical security is basically outside the door, and most usually is related to perhaps the use of IoT for actually protecting the door, okay, and automating the entry of the door. That is physical security. But when you actually talking about cyber security, now we are talking about actually how to actually for you to actually make sure that the correct people enters the door. Okay, what are the access control that you have in place to make sure that the door opens to the correct people, and who actually manages the system that you use to actually open and closing the door. So now there is the difference. The IoT there is controlling the physical security, but the policy and the logic behind that is covered by cybersecurity. So that is cybersecurity. Now on to our next coverage, which is information assurance. So what it means by having an information assurance in an organization. And also this is the topic for your subject. So what is it actually? Okay, so basically IA, the one that you are studying now, is the study of basically how do you actually protect your information asset, meaning from any risk that could come to it. This could also mean that from destruction, degradation, manipulation, and exploitation from unauthorized people, or perhaps people that bring harm to your organization. So you need to actually protect your information asset in this case. Secondly, how do you actually recover should any of those events should happen? So IA in this sense means that you need to actually estimate what could happen from the risk that you identify, and then if that event should happen, how do you actually recover the information asset, or perhaps get back the asset that you perhaps could lose or destroy. should the event that you estimate or predicted happen. So here, you need to remember that IA is a both proactive and also a reactive process. Proactive means that you do the estimation and prediction first. You properly plan. Okay, you have these sets of asset. What harm could actually come to it? Okay, this usually you have to have a good team with you to actually plan. Okay, these are the assets that you have. What are the risks that could involve in obtaining or using the asset? And then how do we respond should the event happen? So that is basically information assurance. You have a proper assurance should anything happen to your asset, and then you properly plan what are the control mechanisms to protect that asset and what should be done should certain event happen. All right, so that is information assurance. So now we look at some example, and this example is from the point of view of the customer or the user of your service, for example. So for example, imagine you are actually visiting an e-commerce website. This is you as the customer. So usually, before you type in highly sensitive or personal information to a service or a website, you actually want to have some assurance, okay, that your information will be protected. You remember when you actually going to CIMB Clicks, for example, or when you actually want to use Maybank to you, or you want to use Shopee or Lazada. So how do you actually ensure that your information there is safe? So do you have this assurance? So how can you actually know that a certain website or services is actually a secure, or perhaps your information is safe? So there is usually a certain things that you expect from a website or a service. So what are the security relevant things you want to happen or not happen when you use such a website? Okay, can you know what you actually expect things to happen? Usually you expect that you can actually have your credentials being verified. You have a password system, for example. Or if let's say you fail to actually enter your password, perhaps you have a two-factor authentication. Perhaps there will be a message sent to your phone to verify that you attempt a login to that particular service. So that is some of the security relevant things you want to happen and not happen. Should you fail to enter a password, for example, perhaps it will send you a message to your phone. And then you also perhaps there will be a tag verification. You know, when the service send a number or verification number to your phone for you to actually have a second level verification. That can also be an expected thing. And also, when you want to actually use the service for the first time, usually you want to look at the reviews. Usually you want to look whether that site have a proper security certification. So that is an expectation, or that is when you have proper assurance for your service. So you put yourself first when you actually want to give the service to your customer, what is expected from them. So you put your place in the shoes of your customer. Okay, how can you trust a business? And then when you are providing the service, how can people actually trust you? Right? So you might want the privacy of your data, okay, the protection against perhaps any threat of phishing, for example, or being threatened by malware. You want to have integrity of your data. You want to have proper authentication, authorization. You want to have proper confidentiality of your private information. Okay, and then you want to have non-repudiation, means that you want yourself to be trusted. Okay, you don't want to perhaps have anonymity. Okay, but you perhaps you want anonymity, but you don't want to actually that business to become anonymous and cannot be trusted or tracked. And then you want to have your data will be there when you want it. What else? Okay, think about it. So this is basically an expectation from the customer, and then this expectation you need to properly discuss with your team when you are providing a service to ensure that their information asset that they give to you is properly protected. So before we continue to part 2, let's review what we have learned in the first part. So remember, the first part is you need to differentiate between what information asset is, okay, what is information assurance, what is information security, and what is actually cybersecurity, and lastly, what it means by having information assurance. Okay, so we take a 5-minute break, then we continue, and while or before you continue, please remember to review those points. So now on to part 2, which is the components. Now, to understand the components, remember previously that we have looked at what IA is. Remember that IA is both a proactive and reactive process. Thus, the components also correspond to that requirement. So proactively, there must be a certain way for you to actually establish a protection for your information asset. So this you need to ensure the CIA. Remember what CIA is? You have learned that before in computer security and also cyber security essentials, where CIA is the confidentiality, integrity, and also availability of your information or your information asset. And also you need to ensure the authenticity and also the non-repudiation of information. So in terms of that, you need to actually be proactive also after you implemented certain security measures. So what are the detection methods that you have to protect perhaps attacks or threats coming to your information? So what is the attack detection mechanism that you have installed to actually protect your information asset? And also the second portion of the components is the capability of restoration. How many backups you have, for example. And then how do you respond to attack? Can you actually identify the actors or perhaps the threat that comes? What are the motives? Okay, what are the causes? And then what will be that implication to your organization? So by being both proactive and reactive, and these components is there, you know, the protection, the restoration capability, the detection, and the response is there. Then you have proper information assurance installed for your information asset. So we will actually look at this in the coming chapters, but for now, you just remember the keyword here, the proactive and reactive. And then what are the corresponding components with regard to being proactive and also being reactive? So to further differentiate or perhaps giving proper tasks to the correct people, you need to understand, okay, what group of people that you need to actually be on board with your information assurance or security project. So first of all, we look at IA, IS, and also the CS. There are three separate categories. They can sometimes be of the same people because depending on the size of your organization, or they can be a separate group of specialists depending on how big your organization is. So when we talk about IE, it's very much focuses on the business process. Remember, you have information asset. Alright, so information asset includes that when your customer actually enters that information and when you actually keeping that information and perhaps use back that information to help their transaction. So IA focuses more about information asset valuation. What is the value? How to optimize the protection and also the usage of the information, okay, how to continuously assess the protection mechanism, the proactive and reactive process, okay, in terms of management planning, auditing, and also the governance of information. So this basically involve the business sense of information protection. And then you have the information security IS. So this one carries out the priorities, okay, that the IA professional have crafted. So basically IA is the management side, IS is the one of implementer, that the one that have been planned by the IA people. So basically you identify people that actually could do, okay, the protection, the reactive, and also the proactive response to your threat that you identify. Now, the cybersecurity people focus on the technical, applied, and theoretical. So this is particularly you need to have a deep understanding of how computers do what they do, to identify vulnerabilities, do risk assessment, focus on the what ifs, which enable them to create solution. Okay, so this will be you in the future, the CS. But you need also this knowledge. Perhaps someday you will become the IA people. You will become one of the people in the management who decides what to protect, okay, how to protect it, okay. And usually when you enter into a workforce, for example, you will usually enter as a cyber security specialist first. Okay, you will become the security technician, security architect. That will be your role when you enter the workforce. Okay, but again, depending on the size of the organization, okay, the bigger the organization is, there will be more categories of specialists there in the organization. Okay, but sometimes if the category of company is perhaps very small company, then you will become an IA, IS, and also CS people in one group of uh, job or occupation. So you will become the ones that is actually doing the IA job, the IS job, and also the CS job. Okay, that's why information assurance is important, because you need to actually properly plan. Remember the proactive and reactive process, and also you need to know what to actually implement, because although IA is a business process, but you need to actually know who is the correct people to actually being assigned to those tasks, meaning for the assessment of risk, who will be capable enough to do it. For the implementing of security controls, who will actually have the expertise to actually do the implementation and maintaining the control. So this is basically a very it is a big cycle of process, and you need to actually have a knowledge in this in order to properly plan for what to expect and how to respond. So having said that, these are some of the examples of what is the task involved with the IA, IS, and the CS professionals. So basically, like I said before, IA involves business related process. This is where you get to risk assessment, risk management, planning, budgeting, and basically the governance, auditing, and compliance framework. So these are the one that is actually deciding what needs to be done, who needs to do it. And then IS is the technical and applied information assets. You are actually protecting the information asset. You are actually doing the design. You are actually doing the configuration. You are basically having to make sure that whatever the business people have decided is properly designed and configured. And also in terms of cybersecurity, this is the one that is both applied and also in terms of theoretical, because if you are from the cybersecurity field, you can both be an applied and also be on the business management side. So the cybersecurity here focus on the information asset and the raw data, and what is actually needs to actually make sure that whatever is being designed and configured can be implemented. This includes also the malware analysis, and also forensics. Should anything happen or incident happen, then you need the forensics people coming in to actually analyze what could happen, who causes it, and perhaps there is a proof that those people is doing it, so that you can actually bring those people to law and be punishable. And also, what are the actions to actually protect and also react to certain situation. So these are just examples. Okay, again, depending on the size of the organization, okay, then there will be a specialized group of people there to actually work on this solution in terms of managing, planning, designing, and also implementing the solution. So in terms of the IA model, you need to look at the IA process as a three-dimensional process. What it means that, okay, you need to actually have a way to actually to recognize whatever you want to protect. You need to properly categorize what you are protecting, categorize what you are implementing. So you need to systematically think. Remember, IA is a proactive and reactive process. So you need to properly categorize what assets you have, okay, what risk could come to that asset, how do you respond to that risk that is coming. So systematically think of a solution, okay, either to actually protect it, the control, and also how to actually react or respond if the event happen. So basically, you need to actually see both the IA and security problems through different sides of the services and also solution. So you see that here we have the information state. So currently, when your users are entering, for example, the information, okay, so what are the state of information? Is it a raw data? Is it the processed data, for example? And how does the data travel? So how do you store, process, and transmit? And also the services, okay, what do you do with the information that you have? All right, so this is through the CIA, you know, the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and all that. And also the security measures. Security measures include the technology, the policy and practice, and also the training and education with the people involved. Training can also mean training the users that is also using the information, and also include the training for the people to protect that information. So we will cover that later on in the later topics. Okay, but remember that IA is a three-dimensional process. You need to understand the information, the service that you are providing for that information, and also the countermeasures, which also involve the people that is actually using that information. So when you look at the services that you are providing, you look back again at the information security model. Okay, so back to the beginning, what are the pillars of information or computer security? So you will remember that you will have the integrity, availability, and confidentiality. You know, the CIA. So how do you actually provide confidentiality to your customer or client? How do you protect or how do you provide integrity? How do you ensure availability? So again, remember, always go back to the pillars, the CIA, and what are the mechanisms that you can actually do in order to ensure that you have this and the people is assured that they have this while they are using your service. So these are the concerns that you need to think about when you are planning for your solution. So in terms of security service problem, we look at these examples. So again, remember for the possible security problems with regard to the pillars. So you will have confidentiality, integrity, availability, authentication, and non-repudiation problem. So for confidentiality, for example, So you have people is not authorized to view a certain data. So these are just an example of what people or what perhaps threat that could come to your information. So you have perhaps that you have data leaks, you have someone copying. Okay, these are just example of confidentiality problem. And then integrity. Okay, someone hacks into a banking system to add money, and employee deletes incrementing evidence. So you don't have integrity there if that thing could happen, but it is good for you to identify the type of problem under which pillar. Now, availability, of course, denial of service, where people cannot get to that information when they actually want to use that information. Okay, authentication means that your control mechanism to actually ensure that the correct people actually use their information fails because people can bypass that perhaps through brute force attack or using keylogger to get the password, okay, or they get the password because someone does not protect the password very well. So by understanding this risk, for example, you need to identify how do you actually ensure that people understand the importance of their password. This can come from perhaps training or having a proper policy for protecting the password. So we will look at that later on. And then a non-repudiation. Okay, for example, online shopper purchases and download a software package, but later claim he never downloaded it. Okay, non-repudiation means that someone wants to actually be released from the responsibility. So how can you ensure that every action, okay, can be tied to a person? Okay, that is a non-repudiation problem. You want to ensure that people can be actually tracked back to whatever they do on perhaps on paper or perhaps there is some way for you to track of what your users are doing or what people are doing with your information. How do you ensure that? So this that is listed here is some of the possible problems there that could come, okay, when you are providing services to your customer or perhaps your organization. So you need to think back and get back to your team, for example, to always scrutinize each and every part of this possible problem when you are providing service. Okay, that's why you need a very good team to do it, to identify the problem, to identify the solution. The next dimension is understanding where the data is. So this with regard is to the information state. So where is the data that is moving? How do you move the data? Right? So for example, during transmission of data, how do you transmit the data from your user to your server actually? So identify that. And then how do you store the data once it is in your possession? How do you protect it? For example, how do you have proper backup for that data? And then how do you process the data? How do you ensure there is no third party involved in the processing of that data? How do you ensure that people cannot intercept, okay, the processing of the data? How do you properly process the data? Do you keep the password in the plain text, for example? Okay, how do you actually encrypt the data? So the information state concerns about where the data is. So this is also important when you are planning the solution. Okay, how do you transmit? How do you store? How do you process? Because this is also important in having proper assurance mechanism installed there. Because if people don't understand how to do you transmit the data, perhaps there will be a loophole that can be actually used by the attacker, or there is a risk of the data being leaked, for example. So the transmission is data needs to be understood. And now we look at the security countermeasures, another dimension, okay, in the IM model. So now we look at who can actually enforce and check the security. What are the countermeasures that you have in your organization or around your organization with regard to the information that you want to protect? Okay, who are the people? What are the policies and practice there to actually protect the asset that you want to protect? And then what are the technology you have to actually protect the information or the assets that you deem worthy to protect? So the people is the very heart and soul of a secure system. Okay, these people, okay, not just your technical people, but also who are the people you have in your organization. You can even have cleaners, for example. They can be a very critical people that you need to actually have proper understanding of the security mechanism that you have. Perhaps just simply opening and entering the door, which involve physical security. But people need to understand that they are part of the big security ecosystem. So in order to have that, so that's why you need to have the proper policy and practice. So how do people actually know what to do? What is the proper practice? Are they well trained enough to actually do the security implementation that you want to do? Do you have proper training for that? So this is the proper policy and practice. And then the technology. Okay, you have perhaps the crypto system, the protection hardware, software, OS. Okay, but most importantly, you need to know that all these things need one another. So you need to, if you have the technology, you need the people to actually do it and understand it. And you need to have proper policy to ensure that people understand the importance of the implementation that you want to have. So the most important here is that manage your people first, have proper policy, and then you have the proper technology to actually implement the security mechanism that is understood by your people. So another way to look at having proper information assurance is to look at the defense in-depth diagram. So basically, defense in-depth, you have this ecosystem of security implementation. Okay, this can also be cross referenced with the previously that you have the people, the policy, and also the technology, but in just a different setting or different ecosystem. So here in the defense in-depth, okay, you will see the framework where you have the private cloud, you have the private cloud, the public cloud, you have the security implementation, you have the operations, you have the prevention. So again, if you look at back at the previously that we have discussed earlier, so where is the policy? So the policy can be here in terms of the operation and also the prevention. So what are the security technology perhaps? This can also be here. The prevention, what are the mechanisms that you have to prevent break-ins, for example? And then also in terms of operation, perhaps you have proper authentication mechanism. Okay, and then this also includes the perimeter security, okay, the network security, endpoint, application, and also data security. And then this is also perhaps if you are actually handling public cloud. So people are entering, for example, your organization or using your service through the public cloud, and perhaps your people are using your service through the private cloud. Okay, these are the things that you need to consider when you are actually planning your security control for your protection of asset. So this is just a guidance, one of the guide, okay, that you can use to actually plan for your security control mechanism. So remember, it is both a proactive and reactive process. So you can use this, okay, as a guide to actually identify. So proactively, what can we implement in terms of perimeter security? And then also reactively, how do you ensure that when people actually entering the perimeter, how can we react if it is an intruder. So that is just one example of how you can use this diagram. Okay, use it to actually plan for your security mechanism. Okay, identify where data is moved to and fro from your organization, and then understand the people, the policy, and also the technology that you can use to protect your information. Now, in the previous part, you have learned about the model of IA and also what are the components in there, and also what is the importance pillars that you need to actually ensure when you are actually implementing or planning to have information assurance for your asset. Okay, so before we continue, understand those points and take a 5-minute break before we continue. Alright, so we move on to part 3. Now, after identifying the components and identifying the right people, okay, in planning, you need to also understand how can you approach a problem after you identify the solution. Because in implementation, this can be accomplished two ways. Okay, it can be from the bottom up or it can be from the top down. So which one is actually much more preferable or much more convenient to your organization? It depends. Now, look at this diagram. Okay, digest it first. Okay, so in an organization, usually there will be these people, okay, where you need to actually deal with or actually implementing certain security mechanism. So you can see from this diagram, okay, from the top, you can see that you have the CEO, the CIO, for example, CFO, COO, okay, and then you have the manager, you have the admins, and you have the technician. Okay, simply put, a top-down approach is where you have the implementation, okay, is initiated by the top management, while the bottom-up, it is initiated by the implementer, the admin, and the technician. Okay, so you have the top-down from the management, and also you have the bottom-up approach, okay, from the technician up to the CEO. So which approach you think is much more easier to being implemented and followed by the people? Understand? Okay, now we go on to the next part. So before you decide which approach is the best, you need to understand, okay, how is it done? Alright, for the top-down approach, it is best because it is usually initiated or is considered best because it is initiated by the upper management. So this involves the issuance of policy, the procedures, and the process, and also the management usually dictates the goal or what needs to be done, who needs to do it. Okay, but the most successful in the top-down approach usually involve formal development of strategy. Okay, so you need to properly plan according to the order, meaning that okay, you don't just simply wake up one morning, okay, and then just okay, we need to do this. Okay, that is not the proper approach. You need to actually carefully plan the approach, meaning that okay, you gather your team, understand how many people you have in your organization, who have the expertise to do it, who can actually plan for it, who can actually implement it. Okay, and then you identify the information asset you have, the risk that you have, the people that you have for your project, okay, the policy that you can implement, and then the technology that can support the implementation. So then that can be a successful top-down approach. Now the second approach is the bottom-up approach. So this is usually the grassroots effort involve the system admin that wants to improve the security of their systems. Usually because system admins and the technical people are the ones that is actually on the front line. They know what are the risks, what is the current thing that's happening to the data, what could come from the data, what the technology that they are using. So these are the people that is on the front line to actually implement the security implementation. So the key advantage of the bottom-up approach is that you have the technical expertise of individual administrator. But the problem is it seldom works because it lacks the number of critical features. Because usually people will not willingly participate, okay, because you are the system admin. Okay, you need to get the management support in order to do that. So this is where you need to actually communicate with your top management. Okay, there are certain problems there, okay, that we need to do it. We lack certain things in terms of security and process, for example. Then you communicate with your management. Okay, but in order to have that, you must have proper management process, meaning that the management must be open to that particular suggestion and option. Okay, so this is the bottom-up approach. You have the grassroots effort. You know the expertise is there. Okay, so let's say later on, if you are in the management side, you need to understand, okay, this advantage that you have. You have people on the front line with that expertise. Okay, listen to them, listen to what they have to say, because they are the one dealing with the threat directly. Okay, so by that, okay, how do you actually see which one is actually preferable? A bottom-up approach or a top-down approach? Okay, of course, in terms of implementation, you need to prefer a top-down approach. But in terms of expertise of dealing with the threat directly, you have the expertise from the grassroots there. So perhaps you can think of a workaround or perhaps a merge of this approach. Alright, so let's review what we have learned today in part 1. So you look at the definition of IA and then followed by the components of IA and the models, how do you actually view it. And remember importantly that IA is a proactive and reactive process. And how do you approach a security solution? You have the top down, you have the bottom up, okay? But in order to implement that, you need to understand who are the people that you have in your organization, who will be the implementer, who will be the planner, who will be the ones that actually dictate, okay, what to do. Okay, so by that, I end today's lecture, but I will give and distribute the assignments for your first task, your group task. Alright, so we will discuss that further in our next session there. Okay, I thank you for viewing the video and I hope it's beneficial and helpful to you. Thank you very much.